Okay, I'm hoping you can see that. Super. Um, okay, so to just outline the sort of structure of today's talk, I'm going to start with a very brief discussion of the problem of climate change and think about how music might be able to help. So just a brief overview of the article that Lisa mentioned. And then I'm going to explore some questions about if we're studying the effects of musical pieces on listeners' environmental attitudes or beliefs, and what variables do we need to consider? And then what if the music is a multimedia experience, and potentially how can we optimize that experience? And then I'll try to come to some kind of conclusion at the end. So climate change is a global emergency. You can see the climate stripes for Hull at the top of the screen there. So I expect most of you are familiar with these. If not, the bluer colours are cooler temperatures, and the darkest red is the hottest temperature, and the others are kind of in between. And you can see that since records began, the temperatures have shifted towards the red colours, and in the far right, you've got the very hottest colours. As a result of this, some researchers predict catastrophic collapses to human society within the next few decades. So it's a really serious and urgent problem. Governments and industry still need to take further urgent action, and estimates also suggest that the general public isn't doing enough either to overcome this accelerating problem. So it's a problem for everybody. It's a problem that governments need to tackle, but we also need to address individual behaviour change as well. If you just tell people to change their behaviour, they tend not to do it. So we need novel approaches to change environmental behaviour. So when I started thinking about this, I wondered, I'm obviously, as a music psychologist, I'm aware of the power of music. And here we have an urgent global problem. And I started thinking about whether music might be able to help with this. That's not to say that music should always have that kind of function, because obviously music is wonderful anyway. And, you know, it should be written to express ourselves in all kinds of ways, and it should be enjoyed without thinking about any additive effects. It's just brilliant. But if we can kind of capture some of that power and use it to help us with this problem, then let's sort of see how that might work. So what I did was I looked at theories within environmental psychology that looked at the reasons why people make decisions in relation to environmental behaviour, and what variables were involved in those. And then I looked at those variables and tried to compare them with evidence from music psychology that suggested that music might be able to play a role within this kind of decision making. And the result of that examination kind of was 12 research questions that you can see in this rather tiny texted diagram. So some of those questions related to our favourite music, some of them related to behaviours surrounding music, and others of them related to specially created music. And it's that kind of category that I'm really thinking about today. So when you distill those kind of research questions, you find that especially creative music that might help to change climate-related behaviour might have qualities that make us feel heroic, or make the music seem heroic, because that might boost feelings of outcome efficacy. Now, this is the idea that something we're doing has a meaningful effect on climate change. So if you feel that something you're doing does have a meaningful effect, you're more likely to do it. Music that encourages empathy or altruism has the potential to influence altruistic or biospheric values. So this is the kind of worldview that if it's strong biospheric values, you really value the natural world. If you have strong altruistic values, you tend to value other people, and both of those are associated with pro-environmental attitudes and behaviours. Thirdly, you might have music that references the natural world because that can increase the salience of biospheric values, make us think about the environment a little bit more. And you might also have music with environmental messaging that may influence environment-related attitudes or beliefs. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So there are lots and lots of examples of pro-environmental music. It's very hard to sort of pick examples when you're doing this because they're so varied and from so many different genres, including ecoacoustics as well. There are some instrumental works, some vocal works, some are composed electronically. Music's been used to impart urgent and important messages about the environment and to communicate climate change. And some work has been done to kind of categorize some of these works. So Wodak suggests that some works communicate information, and they tend to take scientific data and interpret it in some way musically, whereas others convey information, so that might be a more kind of poetic representation of the ideas behind climate change, probably not based on data. And composers' intentions have also been studied. When we've been thinking about how to test whether music actually has an effect on pro-environmental attitudes or behaviour, we've kind of found ourselves tying ourselves in knots a little bit, because quite a lot of these examples actually don't just have music. They actually tend to be associated with either information or lyrics or a film. So that kind of gives rise to two questions. So if we're studying the effects of these pieces on listeners' environmental attitudes or beliefs or behaviours, what variables might we need to consider? And if that is a multimedia experience, how can we start to understand which aspects of that experience might be helpful and influential? Okay. So I've been looking at previous research in relation to emotion. This is a relatively familiar field for me because I did my PhD on emotional responses to music. So that might explain part of the reason for going to it, but there are other reasons too. So emotional responses to music listening are complex, but they may share some of the same variables as those involved in changing environmental attitudes and beliefs. And what's more, emotions are often, though not always, involved in individuals' changes in climate-related beliefs, attitudes, and behaviours. So it seems sensible to kind of look at emotion models to start with and try to adapt those in relation to environmental attitudes and behaviours. So if we look at some of the emotion research, there's been a need highlighted to consider aspects of the music when we're looking at emotional responses, aspects to do with the listener, which is sometimes known as individual factors, and aspects to do with the situation. All of these things have an effect on the induced emotional responses to music. When we're thinking about musical factors, those can include structural features of the music and performance features. So the performance features are kind of the more expressive components of the music. The structural features are kind of the slightly more fixed aspects, the notes, the rhythm, that kind of thing. When we're thinking about situational factors, the location that you're in when you're hearing the music and the particular event, whether it's a formal event or whether it's just you listening casually, these sorts of things will have an effect on your emotional responses. In terms of individual factors, musical expertise, stable dispositions such as personality, taste in music, and your current motivational or mood state will all affect your emotional responses. We can adapt that slightly for pro-environmental music. So we know that from environmental psychology research, changes in attitudes or behaviour are also influenced by individual factors and situational factors. But some of those are slightly different from the musical the variables associated with emotional response to music. So models involving environmental attitudes or behaviour should incorporate those. So we might have structural and performance features of the music that combine to create music that's heroic, encourages empathy and altruism, or references the natural world. Those are hopefully familiar from a previous slide. When we're thinking about situational factors, not only the location and event matter, but also timing. So when one of the best times to change behaviour is when somebody's life has a kind of natural change. So if you're changing jobs, that's a moment where people might be more persuadable to catch public transport to get to their new job rather than use their car, for example. In terms of individual factors, you have both the musical sort of expertise and stable dispositions, but you also have environmental expertise and stable dispositions. So not only will musical preferences play a role, but also environmental values, knowledge, beliefs, personality influences both of those. Somebody's political affiliation matters in terms of environmental values and knowledge and beliefs. Whether they live in a rural or urban location and their affiliation to nature, all of these things affect somebody's kind of baseline level of environmental attitude and behaviour. But as I said earlier, music in this context is often accompanied by other things, whether that is sound effects or video and things like that. So Nick Cook, in his book, Analysing Musical Multimedia, points out that viewers rarely hear the music just as music when they're experiencing within a multimedia experience. He suggests music transfers its own attributes to the storyline and the product it creates. Coherence engenders music meanings of its own, but it does all this, so to speak, silently. The music deals primarily with responses, that is, with values, emotions, and attitudes. It exploits cross-modal correspondences. So what we see in one domain, perhaps the visual domain, is usefully kind of coordinated with what we hear and the other things that are involved in that experience. And importantly, he argues that music is rarely, if ever, an experience of a single sense. It's rare that we only hear music. Normally, if it's a live performance, we often see the performer. There are other aspects of the performance that are involved as well. So this isn't just appropriate for film music. It might be appropriate for all kind of musical experiences. Annabel Cohen also looks at the functions of music in film or multimedia. So she points out that it masks extraneous noise, it provides continuity, it directs attention to important features of the screen through structural or associationist congruence. So when the sound is aligned with certain features of the visual element, that directs our attention. It induces emotion and mood, it communicates meaning and furthers the narrative, especially in ambiguous situations. It can act as a leitmotif, but importantly, I think it heightens absorption. But this is kind of genre dependent, so that heightened absorption is not necessarily shown with more realistic genres. It also adds to the aesthetic effect of the film. Cohen's also develops a model of how emotional responses are formed in response to film music, film as a whole, including the music, perhaps I should say. So you can see at the bottom, you have the different elements of the experience at the bottom. So text, speech, visuals, music, sound effects, and the kinesthetic surface. And it's really important to mention that kinesthetic surface is to do with not only kind of technology that enables us to feel elements of an experience. So people have developed a haptic glove and things to give vibrations that are kind of designed in accordance with a film. So it could be things like that, but it could also be our embodied understanding of other senses. So when you see a person moving in a certain way, we understand that through our own understanding of our body's movement. Equally, music has embodied elements as well. So it's quite a broad category, that kinesthetic surface. So when we first experience those, we have a fast kind of response from each of those surfaces up to the long-term memory, and that allows us to generate expectations about what's going to happen and story grammar. And those expectations contribute more slowly to the working narrative. Each of the surfaces from the bottom at level B are analysed both independently in terms of structure and meaning and in their relationship to one another. And those contribute more slowly to the working narrative as well. When we combine that model with the individual factors, situational factors, and emotional response, it can look something like that. If we try to adapt that for environmental attitudes, it looks kind of similar. Our emotional response is still generated. That contributes to environmental attitudes, but sometimes environmental attitudes might be changed more directly. So how might we optimize each surface to promote positive changes in environmental attitudes? So if we're thinking about the music surface, we've said this before, but we might think about heroic music, music that encourages empathy or altruism, and music that references the natural world. If we're thinking about the visual surface, we might think about colour, because colour can influence many aspects of human behaviour as an implicit affective cue. Colour can carry associations with nature, or association more generally, so blue and green are associated with nature and calming emotions. And it can influence environmental behaviours as well. Or certainly intended environmental behaviours. Green tends to be associated with pro-environmental behaviours, and black tends to be associated with pollution, for example. So if we had a musical performance, could we use the lighting, the clothes that the performers wear, or other visual inputs? Could those use these natural-based colours, and would that enhance the kind of potential to influence environmental attitudes and behaviours? In terms of images, there is research that suggests that still photographic images can influence environmental attitudes. So awe-inspiring nature images promote favourable attitudes towards pro-environmental policies, possibly through pleasant effects. Positive images increase pro-environmental attitudes and pro-environmental intentions. But there's a bit of a nuance here, because although positive images stimulate positive emotions, they sometimes reduce our intention to act. Whereas negative images, if you see, say, a beautiful setting with litter, that stimulates negative emotions but increases our willingness to act. So a study that my PhD student, Tongjia Zhang, is running at the moment is investigating how images and vocal music combine to influence environmental attitudes. So yeah, watch this space. In terms of sound effects, we know that natural sounds are evaluated more positively than human sounds, that they enhance ratings of images, but that congruence is important. Natural sounds are often integrated in a musical context, with or without film. So if we're thinking about ecoacoustics and soundscapes, these kinds of sounds are used a lot. So not only might that have the potential to increase biospheric values, Tora, who we're going to hear from in a moment, has suggested that the kind of listening that we practice when we're listening to music might encourage more attentive listening to natural sounds as well. In terms of the kinesthetic surface, as I mentioned, it might encompass physical stimuli that provide kinesthetic input, but also embodied understandings of other aspects of the multimedia experience. And various aspects of bodily communication, so facial expressions and body posture, are thought to contribute to successful pro-environmental communication. So there could be potentially an interaction there. When we're thinking about the text surface, lots of music is accompanied by program notes, album notes, or information, as well as there potentially being text on the screen of a film or a music video. Program notes have been found to be useful sometimes, but sometimes rejected. And we know that biographical information can influence emotional responses to music. Ruth also investigated media coverage of the artists and looked at how that influenced the reception of pro-social lyrics. They found that neutral media coverage resulted in the most positive appraisal of an artist's music. So there are clearly potential interactions there. In terms of lyrics, these are slightly different. They're obviously, we have expectations about lyrics that we don't have about prose. Music and lyrics are processed by different neurological systems. And we know that pro-social lyrics can lead to more pro-social behaviour, but that can be affected by familiarity in the musical features. And environmental educationalists have recommended the use of music with environment-related lyrics. There are lots of examples of popular music with pro-environmental lyrics. And I'm currently doing a study with Blake Morton that's looking at the potential influence of pro-environmental lyrics on environmental attitudes. There's another potential speech surface, which is spoken word. So this might be the narration or dialogue in film, or it might be clips of speech within music. When environmental information is presented, longer, complex information is more successfully absorbed in written form, but short texts are recalled better when they're spoken. So sometimes written form is better, but when you segment information, it can be absorbed quite well in spoken form. And there's a kind of integrity effect. So when we're thinking about information that people are using in a discussion, people are perceived as more credible when they're seen in a TV broadcast rather than a radio broadcast or a magazine article. So we probably use information that we see as well as what we're hearing when we're making judgments about people's integrity. So that's kind of ran through some of the surfaces. So this is a reminder of that model, but you probably noticed that I actually have more surfaces or more attributes of that music and that musical experience than were on the original model. So we end up with something more like this. So as you can see, we have text, speech, lyrics, colour, visual images, music, sound effects, and kinesthetic. So I separated out the colour and the visual images because I think there are kind of independent, separate effects, and they might be things that musicians potentially could manipulate separately. I separated the speech and the lyrics because there are different expectations around each of those within music. Yeah, but it's essentially the same model, but with more categories. But how might we take those different aspects and optimize those? When we're looking at pro-environmental communication, there's a lot of expertise here, and there are lots of different methods for pro-environmental communication. Some of them involve information campaigns, and that's probably the most likely way that musicians would try to communicate information and express themselves. So the ones that they don't always produce behaviour change in information campaigns, but the ones that are more effective tailor their messages to the audience. They communicate other benefits of climate action. They target the times and locations of decision making. They think about moral or social influence through normative messaging. So this is highlighting what large groups of other people do to encourage people to do it. They promote self-efficacy instead of or in addition to appealing to fear. So making people know that they can do something. And they encourage the setting of specific and realistic goals. However, there's also research that suggests that narrative presentations of information can be more effective than logical, kind of fact-based presentations. There's also best practice established for climate awareness films. So this is a study by Banchero, Rector and Van Ballenberger from 2021. And their recommendations are similar. So they're tailoring it to their audience. They're using aspects of the audience's culture to really hone their message down on the groups that they're targeting. But also they use evocative cinematic imagery. They're thinking about the emotional impacts. They're thinking about narratives as well. So we can look at both of those kind of sets of recommendations on the same page there. So if we kind of transfer some of those recommendations to the model, you end up with a kind of filter at the bottom that influences the kind of creation of those potential different layers, perhaps, or it could be used in that way. So we have the situational factors at the bottom. We have the best practices employed in each of those strands. Then the listener or viewer can make sense of those in the same way. That will be influenced by musical environmental expertise and stable dispositions and the current motivational mood state. That creates a working narrative that influences emotional response and changes in environmental attitudes. So just to have a short example, or two actually, this is the first example. So have a think as you're listening. You might want to read the text on the right, which is about half of the text that comes with the album. I couldn't fit it all on the slide. Have a think about what's being used and referenced in the video, and obviously listen to the lovely music. So if we adapt that model to that particular example, we might take out some of the strands that are involved. There's a sense in which that uses certainly emotion, if not storytelling, and it also uses references to the natural world, so we can highlight aspects of the environmental communication best practices. And there was a certain amount of congruence between the visual images and the music, though I don't know if the keen-eyed of you spotted that some of the violin playing visuals weren't aligned with what was going on musically, I think. So perhaps there was a little lack of congruence in that particular aspect. But overall, you can see lots of elements of good practice, references to nature, emotional kind of responses are generated as well. Have I got time for this next example? Or am I running short?
No, go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
That's okay. Great, thank you. So this next example is the Rising Sea Symphony by Kieran Brunt, which is described not as a musical piece, though it's a symphony. It's described as an experimental documentary, and it's a collaboration with Lawrence Grissell. So it's a piece loosely structured around that of a symphony, which weaves different layers, vocal, orchestral, and electronic layers, in and out of spoken word and field recordings from places around the world where rising sea levels are causing natural disasters. And that was taken from the website. And the image here is from Kieran Brunt's website as well. So I'm just going to play a short clip of that.
The Arctic is warming and warming. The more the ice melts, the more sea level.
Raise the average sea level around.
What's happening in the Arctic does not stay in there.
You deserve it. The ice reflects up to 90% of the sun.
It's not just a car.
Potentially catastrophic implications.
like a song.
The ice has its own sound.
It's like singing. It's like a song. The Arctic winter is to me the soul of the Arctic. 90 days of complete darkness.
Unlike anything you felt before. The hurricane winds are so powerful.
We are extremely isolated here.
Okay, I'm going to pause it there. But you get a sense of at least one part of that work. So if we adapt the model for this one, we have text, because we had an introduction to the piece. We have speech within the music and the musical context. We have the music itself, sound effects as well. You heard the footsteps, and probably a kinesthetic interpretation of those footsteps as well. There were references to the natural world. This was an interesting example. You heard voices from newsreaders, but also famous figures like David Attenborough, who has a very distinctive voice. So he is potentially a person that the audience will identify as trustworthy. You had storytelling and emotion, and the messages are tailored to certainly audience cultures, I would say. So you can sort of see the model in action, or as a useful kind of interpretative tool, perhaps, there. So just to conclude, the experience of listening to pro-environmental music is complex and multimodal. And I think we can learn from research about emotional responses to music in different contexts, including with multimodal experiences. And we can also learn from research about best practices in environmental communication and apply those to music and its context. And I think it's possible to start to build a model outlining the potential variables involved in successful pro-environmental communication using music. So I'm hopeful that this model, or whatever it sort of evolves into, could be used for thinking about possibilities for creating musical experiences and potentially developing empirical studies about the most effective combinations of variables to encourage pro-environmental attitudes. It might be that if you have sort of pro-environmental best practices in every kind of strand of input, that could be really effective, or it could just be over the top for the listener. So I think that, and that's sort of an empirical question that kind of needs answering potentially. So hopefully it can be useful in different ways. So if you have any thoughts about the model, it would be really helpful to hear them in the question period, perhaps. But obviously any other questions are welcome too. And there are some references there. But thank you very much for listening.